Hi, loves, and welcome back to Bedtime Stories with Mommy J. And we are continuing with George Brown Class Clown Super Burp by Nancy Krulik and illustrated by Aaron Blecha. And we are on Chapter 8. Let's begin. I've heard about this boy, Mr. Coleman, the school janitor, said to Mrs. Kelly as he walked into the classroom with his mop and pail. He's the one who caused that ruckus in the cafeteria. George hadn't done anything wrong in the cafeteria. He just sneezed. But there was no point in arguing. He was in enough trouble already. Here, Mr. Coleman said to George. He shoved the mop in George's hands. You made the mess. You clean up the mess. Yes, sir, he said. George began moving the wet mop over the gooey raw egg goop. Swish, swish, swish. The sound of the moving mop was pretty much all George heard. It was very quiet in the room. The rest of the class had already gone to lunch. It was just George, Mr. Coleman, and Mrs. Kelly, 2 adults and 1 kid. George, I understand that it's very hard to come into a new school, especially after the school year has started, Mrs. Kelly told him. And I can tell you're a bright boy. But clowning around is not a good way to get to know everyone. You need to try and use some self-control. George wanted to tell his teacher that he'd been trying really hard to control himself. The whole egg thing hadn't been in his control. After the burp, it was like something had just taken over him. But how do you explain something like that to a teacher? Especially when George couldn't even explain it to himself. Grumble, rumble. George heard his stomach rumble, but he understood that he wasn't going to lunch until every drop of egg slime was cleaned up. What George didn't understand was what had made him try to juggle the eggs. He hadn't planned on it. It wasn't part of the trick. It had just happened. He let out that giant burp, and then everything went out of control, just like it had at Ernie's Ice Cream Emporium the night before. George thought back to the night before. He'd seen the shooting star, made that wish about wanting to make kids laugh, and then along came the super burp, and suddenly he was clowning around like crazy. George smacked his forehead. That was it. His wish had come true, but it had also gone wrong. The part about not getting into trouble hadn't come true at all. It was like that part of the wish had been cut off or something. George had wanted to be the one deciding when to fool around, but he wasn't. It was all up to the super burp. That big, giant burp made him do stuff he didn't want to do. Goofy things, bad stuff, stuff that got George in trouble. It was no ordinary burp. It was a magic super burp, and it was bad. George was really starving by the time the floor was cleaned up. He knew he had to hurry if he was going to get to the cafeteria in time for lunch. There was only one problem. George couldn't remember where the cafeteria was. Juliana had taken him there yesterday because she was his buddy. But today, he was on his own, and he was totally lost. Then George smelled something, the familiar scent of spoiled milk, boiled hot dogs, and Jell-O. The smell of school lunch. All George had to do was follow his nose, and he'd be in the cafeteria in no time. And that was the end of Chapter 8, my loves. Make sure you brush your teeth, say your prayers. I hope you have a wonderful and blessed evening. I miss you much. Mwah! Hugs and kisses.